They say we were made in God's image. I believe it. Our achievements surpass imagination. Our creations marveled. But our hearts are not pure. So, in the pursuit of greatness, we built our empires upon death and suffering. But the world we shaped could never last. In the end, we brought wrath upon ourselves to cleanse the corruption. And I was there. When the skies opened and fire rained down from the heavens, I witnessed a new leader rise from the ashes, promising peace. But only death came. Now, as the world wages war, I hide, as the innocent are slaughtered. But there were those that knew these days were coming, speaking of prophecies and signs.
We will be moving toward a one-world government.
Maybe that's why I'm still here, to warn you how the world really ends. This may be a lot to take in, but for me, the world has already ended. Well, the world you know anyway. I remember the whispers about new world orders and the end of days. Of course, who could believe in such nonsense? Or so I thought. The world wanted change. It wanted a new age of peace. Who knew that this pursuit would usher in the very things we feared the most? Now, everything I loved is gone, and I am left with one purpose: to deliver a message, to testify to the truth. I know, just telling you isn't enough. It never was. Truth. Who was it that once asked, "What is truth?" as it stood before him? Nothing ever changes. So, I'll tell you what your future holds, and I'll do my best to prove it is the truth. Not long ago, where you are now, there was a message, a warning that still haunts me to this day. More should have listened. This is how it began. How will the world end? This very debate has been saturated by endless views and opinions,
consumed within a sea of noise. For some, the topic is nonsensical. For others, the answer is clear, as millions look to ancient biblical prophecy as the answer to what lies in wait for humankind's fate. Regardless of what you believe, the very debate has seen a resurgence due to unprecedented global conflicts and instability. With this, however, comes new claims that the long-awaited convergence of prophesied events, destined to trigger the end of our age, is not only entirely real, but have finally begun. Most people agree the world as we know it will come to an end one day, just not in their lifetime. And even if the end was near, it could never be proven, right? So why is it that millions of people all over the world still insist that the end is upon us? Are they naive or misled by skewed religious views? Or is there a deeper understanding? Whispers of truth that have been buried in this generation that are so profound it would change the way we understand everything. But even if such evidence existed, its warnings will likely fall on deaf ears. Often, when one hears about biblical prophecy or the end of days, as it is found within ancient scriptures, such as the Book of Revelation or the Dead Sea Scrolls, many already have deeply ingrained preconceived notions. After all, haven't we heard all this before? Anything new would no doubt just be another claim regarding some astrological event or rare date as a harbinger for the end. And it's not difficult to see why so many have this perception, as endless streams of information and media are absorbed into a desensitized and instant gratification society. News organizations and corporations compete to capture greater market share through sensationalized headlines and claims that result in complex topics being broken down into 8-second explanations, replacing genuine prophetic discussions into viral-worthy predictive claims that often look like this.
Nations begin a new arms race in preparation for global nuclear war.
Prophecy experts point to a celestial sign as the harbinger for the end.
Beginning of the end.
Survival bunkers are now big business as preppers say the end.
Experts say that a solar flare will bring down the grid.
Ending life as we know
Services
it.
report that a massive radiation
Millions prepare for Y2K.
Y2K.
This computer bug will collapse us.
Breaking news from Planet
Eclipse could trigger
The beginning of
The
the
threat of a
end.
global pandemic is at an all-time high.
collapse society.
Astrophysicists discover Planet X, which some say will...
Millions look to the sky.
Dire implications from
The Mayan calendar predicts the world will end in 2012.
Up next, how to make apocalypse puppy cookies.
The Mayan prophecies, obviously, 2012, the world didn't end. So you look at these things and they're so vague and so general, a lot like astrology charts.
And there's the problem. The endless stream of claims that have been ingrained into the minds of the public as billions watch predicted events and dates come and go, yet life marches on as usual. And then there are claims from infamous individuals such as Nostradamus, a French apothecary that lived during the 15th century, that many today attribute credit for predicting the rise of Hitler. Surely he lends some form of credibility to the idea of genuine prophecy. At the very least, the same level of credibility that popularized much of biblical prophecy, right? Actually, most experts disagree.
Or let's say Nostradamus, for example. He speaks in very broad generalities of, things that are going to happen. I could say the same thing. In the future, some man's going to rise up and he's going to have all this incredible power and he'll do this and that. And if I get, 50% close, which odds are probably pretty good, you say, oh, well, see, he prophesied that. But the Bible doesn't do that. The Bible gives you specifics about what's going to happen.
There's a lot of prophecies that are out there. There's the Mayan prophecy, there's Nostradamus, and there's prophecies about dead popes. There's all types of prophecies that are out there. What makes biblical prophecies so different is their accuracy. and we find them in the Bible. What's interesting about this and teaching on Bible prophecy is you're able to find out some things. Many of the prophecies have already come to be. And when we look at the predictions or the so-called prophecies of these other religions, sure, you can have a prediction here, a prediction there, 1 out of 100, 2 out of 100, maybe 3 out of 100.
And that's the amazing thing about biblical prophecy, is that biblical prophecy is something that you can actually study scientifically. It's actually called eschatology, where what the Bible has claimed to be prophetic, in fact 27% of the Bible is prophetic, that the claims that it makes, do they come to pass? Is it true what the Bible has to say?
So, is it? What is the difference between the predictions that have come and gone without fulfillment versus what has been foretold in the ancient biblical scriptures? Non-biblical predictions, which is what most are familiar with, are often made by individuals with heightened public attention due to their sensational and simplified approach to claims regarding a specific approaching date or signs in the cosmos. In addition to the previous examples, there were also those that believed the world would end during the turn of the 19th century, and yet again, just a few years later, in the year 1910, with the appearance of Halley's Comet, that was publicized as a divine signal for the end of the world. But does any of this have anything to do with biblical prophecy? Actually, no. Unlike the countless vague predictions made throughout recent centuries, biblical prophecy contains an unprecedented and complex tapestry of interwoven chronological events and details that present the complete timeline of humankind from the beginning to the end. In fact, the complete ancient scriptures contain over 2,500 prophetic details which were recorded over a millennium by 40 separate authors. In fact, the records are so complete, it's the longest-running contiguous record of human history in existence, and as a result, continues to be studied by universities and independent researchers all over the world. Unlike any other record, the scriptures precede and survived through the rise and fall of countless civilizations, including the ancient Babylonians, Egyptian, and Roman empires. As astounding as the preservation of the records throughout the ages may have been, it also continues to be proven shockingly accurate as archaeologists continue to uncover newly discovered ancient ruins throughout the Middle East, along with hundreds of thousands of artifacts that directly support biblical history and fulfilled prophetic events.
With all of the prophecies that came true regarding the past, we can go all the way back to the book of Genesis, and we can see the development of the nation of Israel over the centuries. You have prophecies regarding Egypt. You have predictions regarding these various things that happened in the book of Daniel. You have the prophecies regarding the Greek Empire and the Roman Empire that came to be. And man, they were fulfilled with 100% accuracy. All of them were.
Just one example of how accurately chilling the events within the prophetic timeline are, we can look to a warning about how just one city in particular, the city of Tyre, would be utterly destroyed by Alexander the Great, recorded 200 years before it was fulfilled in the greatest of detail.
The whole city would be so destroyed that it would be down to the very dust, and then he would throw all the rocks into the sea. Now, if you know the history of Tyre a little bit, you know that King Nebuchadnezzar came and he began to siege the city. But what happened is, in the meantime, while King Nebuchadnezzar was outside attacking the city, the people of Tyre decided that the only option they had was to move their whole city to a little island off the coast, until finally, when they just gave up the city, Nebuchadnezzar got through and everything was gone. Everything of value was gone. Now, if you are a soldier of the ancient world, one of the reasons you're fighting, it's not for the fatherland or something. you want to get those gold plates and all the wonderful things that are in that city. That is your payoff. So Nebuchadnezzar left that feeling very frustrated. But what happened is, years later, Alexander the Great came, and he attacked Tyre, and of course they would not capitulate, and so he took the stones that had been left in ruins from the city on the mainland. He took all those and he threw them into the sea to build a causeway so that Alexander the Great could then go and conquer the city.
Not only did every detail come to pass as it was foretold, but secular history confirms the entirety of this event as the prophecy was fulfilled in July of 332 BC.
You know, this is something that's very specific, talking about what's going to happen to a particular city in a particular way. It's not just this broad generality of what, might happen, where kind of anybody can make up these broad prophecies.
The details surrounding how the destruction of Tyre came to pass is not the exception throughout the ancient prophetic timeline, but rather the rule. But even this is only the tip of the iceberg. The complete prophetic timeline is so detailed and complex in structure that the passing of many events rely on previous prophecies coming to pass first. Like a row of dominoes, if just one event in the timeline doesn't come to pass, the entire chronological and future sequence of events and fulfillments would completely fall apart. In this aspect, there is no other record like this in existence anywhere in the world. But to understand what this all has to do with us today and the end of the world, we first have to follow the timeline through one of the most researched and astounding sequences of prophesied events that history indisputably confirms came to pass, which still sends shockwaves throughout global culture and political landscapes today. A sequence that began around 2,000 years ago, when Jesus of Nazareth walked the earth. Based on historical records, Jesus' birth and life is believed by various researchers to have fulfilled upwards of over 300 prophetic events and descriptions from the Old Testament records, some of which were recorded hundreds to thousands of years before Jesus first walked in Jerusalem. Even the details surrounding how he would be executed were foretold in the prophetic timeline around 400 years before crucifixions were even invented. It was during Jesus' time in Jerusalem that his disciples came to him and asked about the end of the age. They knew that if he was who he truly claimed to be, the prophesied Messiah, then he could tell them exactly what was going to happen to the empires of the earth, including Israel itself. And according to the ancient records, Jesus answered them in shocking detail.
He has told us things that are going to take place at the end of days, at the end of this age. In fact, the disciples, when they asked Jesus about what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age, and he goes through and he starts to tell them all of these different things to look for.
And what Jesus foretold was not what they wanted to hear.
When Jesus was in Jerusalem, Jesus did not talk to the people about the empire growing, the nation ruling the world. In fact, one of the most frightening things that Jesus said to the Jews was not only that the destruction of the temple would happen, but that the Israeli nation would cease to exist. It would be scattered and destroyed.
Not only did Jesus provide details regarding the end of the world, speaking of concepts and global change taking place in the far future, but he also warned of events that would happen much sooner to the nation of Israel itself. He foretold of the complete destruction of Israel and the dispersal of the Jewish people to the four corners of the earth, a terrifying warning that most believed would surely never come to pass. But almost 40 years after Jesus' crucifixion, in 70 AD, the prophecy was fulfilled exactly as he said it would be. The nation of Israel fell by an invading Roman army, led by the future Emperor Titus. The Jewish temple in Jerusalem, a massive structure over 40 acres in size, was completely destroyed so that no two stones laid upon another, just as Jesus foretold, and more than 1 million Jews were slaughtered during the siege of the city. The small surviving remnant of the Jewish people were dispersed to the four corners of the earth. The nation of Israel was so decimated by military force that for all practical purpose, the Jewish bloodline was considered virtually dead. But following the structural rules of the prophetic timeline, there was much more to this prophecy. Decades before the destruction of Israel came to pass, it was also foretold that long after Israel would fall in the future, through utter destruction and displacement, the people would later be regathered into the original land and the nation would be reborn. In fact, Jesus himself, who often spoke in parables, gave such an example through the imagery of a dead fig tree coming back to life at the beginning of the end of days.
Well, there's a prophecy that Jesus gave. He says, learn the parable of the fig tree.
And he talks about how this fig tree, when you see it begin to blossom, that will be the generation that sees his return. Very, very significant statement. Most Bible scholars believe that imagery in the parable of the fig tree is symbolic of Israel. So Jesus himself is saying, when you see that fig tree budding, coming back to life, know that my return is near.
So understanding that the fig tree that Jesus was talking about is in fact Israel. And they say when it comes back, then it will be the last days. It will be the days of Antichrist.
Prophecy foretells that the end of days would begin with the rebirth of Israel. But of course, this event could never happen if the nation and people were not decimated in the first place, presenting more compounding evidence as to the complexity of the ancient prophecies. But if this sequence of events wasn't miraculous enough on its own, additional prophetic details regarding how the rebirth would be fulfilled is something that would leave anyone speechless.
In Ezekiel 37, you have the Valley of the Dry Bones, this picture of all these bones of the Jewish people that have been scattered and separated, coming back together as a nation. We also have the prophecy in Isaiah that talks about how Isaiah is startled to be told that somehow will a nation be born in a single day, asking how does that happen? How do nations just be born in a single day?
As if the prospect that a decimated nation with a remnant scattered to the four corners of the earth could be reborn wasn't hard enough to believe, prophecies recorded over 2,000 years ago clearly foretold that this rebirth would occur in a single day. A seemingly optimistic view, to say the least, but surely one that could never come to pass, as something of this nature has never happened in the history of the world.
There has been no country in the history of the world that has ever been completely destroyed, scattered among all the other populations of the planet, and then reborn in their original homeland, with their original language, with their original heritage intact.
But after 1,800 years, the impossible happened. On May 14, 1948, after the Holocaust and the end of World War II, the nation of Israel was reborn, and the Jewish people once again had a land to call home. The action was ordered by the United Nations and was the first and only time the UN had created a new state by way of a General Assembly vote.
We want to see the time come when we can do the things in peace that we have been able to do in war. If we can put this...
So what we find is in 1948, May 14th, Israel becomes a nation again. This is unheard of. Never has a nation been out of its land for about 1,800 years and then comes back as a people group. It just doesn't happen. They become assimilated and they become part of the rest of the world.
But as miraculous as this event was, this is far from the happy conclusion one might expect, and is merely a milestone within the prophetic timeline that continues on through the end of days, foretold as a sign for things to come.
I believe the greatest sign of our time is the rebirth of the Jewish nation. The last time that there was such a thing as Israel, Jesus Christ himself was walking on the earth. And there are many prophecies that talk about in the latter years and in the latter days, God would regather his people from the four corners of the world.
The prophecies warn that when Israel is reborn, all of the remaining events within the scriptural timeline will come to pass during what is described as the last generation.
There's a lot of Bible prophecy teachers that believe the generation that saw the rebirth of Israel based on the illustration of the fig tree. They believe that those who see the rebirth of the nation of Israel in 1948, then it's that generation of people who will see the second coming of Christ.
What's interesting about Psalm 102, when the Lord shall build up Zion, he shall return in his glory. Well, Zion is a spiritual name for Jerusalem. Jerusalem is being rebuilt right now. And the Lord says he's going to appear in his glory as Jerusalem is being reestablished and rebuilt. And he says this will be written for the generation to come. And that Hebrew word that is used and translated into English, to come, means the last generation, means the end or the terminal generation.
So according to the prophetic timeline, our final hours have already begun, triggered by the rebirth of a nation that is quickly becoming a focal point for global conflict.
So I say this generation will by no means pass away until all these things are fulfilled. And that is why we look to Israel as a major sign that we're in the last days.
So if, for example, if the definition of the last generation is a person born on May 14th, 1948, all of these remaining prophecies will be fulfilled before the end of that person's lifetime.
So, how long is a generation? This is one of the more debated topics in eschatology amongst researchers which see ancient prophecy define a generation in the last days as being around 80 years, and in some examples as long as 120 years. Surprisingly, though the scriptures were written thousands of years ago, these time frames for a generation appear to coincide with exactly what modern medical science defines as one's average to maximum lifespan today, something that was not always the case. For example, only a few hundred years ago, during the medieval age, the average lifespan was only around 35 years.
What we do see developing is Israel is definitely a nation again. And that is really the key. I don't believe it's necessary to go into a position of, well, it's 80 years or 20 years or 40 years from 1948 or 100 years. It's just understanding that we are in the last days because Israel is a nation again. God is gathering the Jews back from the north, the south, the east, and the west.
So if we are indeed living in the last generation, as prophecy claims, then it stands to reason that we are far closer to the end of the world, as most people would want to believe.
There are about 500 future prophecies that are coming together. We are looking for these prophecies to be fulfilled essentially in our lifetime because we are in the last generation. In fact, we're nearing the end of that last generation. So we should start to see the convergence of these prophecies right now happening around the world in front of us.
And it wasn't until Israel became a nation in 1948 that many of these things could even take place. If you were to line up a row of dominoes, Israel is that first piece. It's that first trigger that allows all the other prophecies of Scripture to take place.
Of the estimated 2,500 prophecies contained within the ancient biblical timeline, only 500 of them remain to be fulfilled. So what exactly do they foretell? These final prophecies provide a sequence of specific events foretelling of an unprecedented union of world relations and economic systems that will give rise to a new authority with influence over all global affairs. But as soon as the world achieves this new union and declares peace and safety, humankind will be on the brink of chaos and unprecedented natural events that will usher in a period of death and destruction that is foretold to end 2/3 of the global population. So if we are truly approaching the end of the age, then there should be evidence that the remaining prophesied events are converging to fulfillment right before our very eyes, foreshadowing a perfect storm of global change unlike any other time in history. So has this convergence already begun? Does the foundation for unprecedented global change truly already exist? The remaining prophecies within the ancient timeline foretell of multiple layers of events that converge to trigger what is often referred to as the tribulation period, or the end of days. The first layer of converging global change is the beginning of wars and rumors of wars that result in peace being removed from the earth.
Jesus is giving signs that would indicate that his coming is near, his second coming. One of those is, and you shall hear of wars and rumors of wars, but that is not yet the end. He went on to say, there shall be nation against nation and kingdom against kingdom. But that particular expression, nation against nation and kingdom against kingdom, is actually a Hebrew idiom, and it means world war. Jesus said, world wars will be the sign of the beginning of the end.
And there's going to be some very large wars that are going to be happening on a mass scale. We recognize biblically this is the way that things are going.
We're not talking about isolated skirmishes. We're talking about wars on a global level, many, many wars scattered throughout the world so that the whole world is essentially at war, and rumors of many other wars that will be starting. We're starting to see more wars now and more rumors of wars starting around the world than any other time.
In fact, many of the conflicts we see today are associated with the spread of global terrorism and the threat of attack that could potentially take place in any nation at any time. Unlike regional wars, this new growing threat now affects nearly every person on Earth, and in many aspects directly relates to the unprecedented concept of humankind living in a state where peace is dissipating from our societies and being replaced by fear.
The more these radical terrorists spread around the world, the more people are becoming afraid. I mean, TSA has security, massive security at all the airports. They're afraid that bombs are going to go off in elementary schools, in churches, in buses. And so the more this happens, the more peace is being removed.
Things are getting worse, and we are beginning to see a global outcry for the governments of the world to work together in order to provide peace and safety, foreshadowing the need for dramatic change. But often, change comes through necessity, and according to the sequence of remaining prophecies, that necessity is coming very soon.
Is the world really coming to an end? That's what you want to know, right? Or maybe you're just killing time. I hope not. That's the last thing you have. Everything you've seen so far is your past. Things you should already know. And those warnings about wars and rumors of wars. It's all true. Things changed quickly in those final years. There were so many conflicts in those days that people stopped keeping track. Peace was something that now existed only in our memories, replaced by illusions of progress. We were consumed by a blindness. Other generations might have noticed, but not us. Not the terminal generation. Conflict and change is what we were all born into. Isn't this normal? Isn't this just the way life is supposed to be? Even as the world began to spiral out of control, how could we have known that this was only the beginning of sorrows? Everything from this point on is your future.
There is one foretold war in particular that may be the very catalyst that leads to a demand for that change. A conflict where the scriptures provide such overwhelming detail. It's as if the event was recorded by an eyewitness, shockingly naming countries, describing political coalitions and reasons why the conflict will begin in the first place, and chillingly, the fact that this conflict will last only one day. The additional details surrounding this future event is presented in such detail that it terrifies many theologians, not because of the horrific events surrounding this particular conflict, but rather because many believe the drums of war for the start of this conflict can already be heard. The details, written over 2,000 years ago, name Iran, Syria, Libya, and surprisingly Russia as coming together in the last days to attack Israel. Only a few decades ago, the scenarios surrounding this war stumped theologians as the idea of nations such as Russia allying with Iran to attack Israel appeared politically improbable, if not impossible. But in this last generation, things have changed.
Russia, of course, has a very strong Islamic presence in its southern republics. And there are some who believe that it may just involve the southern republics of Russia. Other Bible scholars believe it's Russia itself that will join Iran and some other countries involved in attacking Israel, one of those being Libya. What's interesting over the last couple of years since the death of Muammar Gaddafi is Libya has also gone more Islamic, and that you could see how an Islamic nation like that would be involved in an attack on Israel.
Actually, in recent decades, Russia has increasingly embraced an anti-Western stand on many political and economic policies and continues to build new relations with the very nations listed in the scriptures, including Iran. In fact, Russia has even recently used Iranian military bases to launch airstrikes in the Middle East. The two nations are working together to build new Iranian nuclear power plants and centrifuges. Russia is also known to have provided stockpiles of missiles and weapons to their numerous Islamic and anti-Israeli allies. This is definitely an alarming sequence of political events that many today could never have predicted, and yet thousands of years ago, this was foretold to happen even before such common interests found amongst these allies, such as worldviews formed by Islam and the United Front to stand against the newly formed Israel, even existed. Because of this, we can now easily see why nations such as Iran, Syria, and Libya would be involved in this war. But why Russia? Though they do have a growing Islamic presence within the nation, it's clearly not as influential as we see within other Islamic states. Surprisingly, though, the scriptures actually tell us why.
Nations are set up exactly as God said they would be. The reason for the war is this leader in Russia who recognizes Israel has something. It's called plunder. Israel has something that the leader of Russia wants. And I believe, and I know many Bible prophecy teachers have believed this for a number of years, that's going to be related to energy.
There seems to be a lot of truth in this. Recently, Israel discovered massive pockets of natural gas, a finding that could potentially shift economic power from Russia and several Islamic states in the region to Israel.
Currently, we recognize that Russia supplies almost all of the gas for Europe. So, the leader of Russia threatened, you know what, I'm